today is a dark day for the United Nations. The speech that was made by the Secretary General, where he effectively tried to find excuses for the Hamas atrocities, the massacres of October the 7th, said these things didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, for goodness sake, what is the conceivable justification? Israel pulled out of every inch of Gaza. You know, if he blames restrictions on Gaza, he should remember that when we pulled out, there weren't restrictions on Gaza. It wasn't the restrictions that led to terrorism. It was really the terrorism that led to the restrictions.
So one of the Israeli hostages who's been released by Hamas has described how she was beaten with sticks during her abduction, driven off on a motorbike with two Hamas fighters and forced to walk through a huge spider's web of tunnels in Gaza. 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz told a chaotic news conference about her ordeal, with her daughter interpreting her words.
Those hostages, 5 of them, she among them, were taken into a separate room. My mom is saying that they were very friendly towards them and that they took care of them, that they were given the medicine, that the people were friendly, that they kept the place very clean. They were very concerned about them.
Well, more than 200 other hostages are still being held, and negotiations to secure their release are complicating Israel's plans for a ground incursion into Gaza. Tonight, The Times reports that President Biden and other leading figures in Washington are urging Israeli officials to delay a ground invasion amidst concern at the risks of such an operation. But Israeli airstrikes are continuing. Gaza's health ministry says almost 5,800 people have been killed there since the 7th of October. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has told the Security Council he believes the bombardment and blockade of Gaza is breaching international law.
Protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, and no fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south itself. I'm deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza.
Well, I've been speaking to Daniel Taub, who's a former Israeli ambassador to the UK. He's also advised Israel's missions to the UN and been a member of Israeli negotiating teams with both the Palestinians and the Egyptians. He began by giving me his reaction to the release of 2 hostages.
Obviously, we're pleased and relieved for every single one of the hostages that is released. These 2, Yocheved and Nurit, 2 elderly women. But of course, their husbands, Amram and Oded, are still in captivity, along with more than 200 other hostages that we know of, and possibly more, because since the massacres of October the 7th, there are 100 Israelis who are still missing or not accounted for, and who knows what they are going through.
As you say, at least 200 still being held by Hamas. And while there is clearly international pressure and negotiations going on to try to get more of those released, do you think that that is causing Israel to at least delay the plans for a ground incursion into Gaza?
So the hostages are a major priority. We're very concerned. We're concerned about the elderly that don't have medication. We're concerned about the children and infants that saw their parents murdered and are now in captivity. And we are absolutely convinced, as you say, that international pressure is absolutely critical. I mean, whatever your views on the politics and so on, this type of behavior is unacceptable. It's beyond belief. Regarding further operations, the ground operation and so on, Israel will clearly act at the time that's most effective to act. There are a number of things that complicate it. One of them is not just the Israeli civilian population. Hamas disdains the lives of its own population. We've been urging them to move south. Many hundreds of thousands have, to try and get away from the area of terrorist activity. But many others, Hamas is actually blocking them. It's actually barricading roads to stop them fleeing. It's confiscating car keys and so on. And if we do go in, we really want to do this in a way that targets the terrorists and protects the civilian population as much as possible.
But many of those who have even fled to the south, many of those who have heeded those warnings to leave their homes and to head to the south of Gaza, have themselves come under attack. We know that there are some 700 people killed in Gaza in the last 24 hours or so, around 5,000 Palestinians dead. Is it not a mistake for Israel to be hitting with airstrikes Palestinian civilians, many of whom have already fled their homes?
So the focus is on the areas of terrorist activity. I would point out, Carol, that Hamas claims to have 100,000 militants, Hamas terrorists. They don't wear uniforms as would be required by the laws of war. They bury themselves in the heart of civilian populations, actually beneath hospitals, behind schools, and so on. And so, the fact, and then if something happens to them, if we're successful in taking them out, then obviously they use these to inflate the civilian numbers. But you're absolutely right. In a situation where Hamas doesn't care about the lives of our civilians or their civilians, we have to take every step possible to try and care about both.
But we've heard from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres this evening saying that he's concerned about what he described as clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. And he was talking there about the Israeli bombardment and the Israeli blockade, which is still preventing many essential supplies getting through, although we've seen a small number of trucks entering Gaza.
I have to say today is a dark day for the United Nations. The speech that was made by the Secretary General, where he effectively tried to find excuses for the Hamas atrocities, the massacres of October the 7th, said these things didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, for goodness sake, what is the conceivable justification? Israel pulled out of every inch of Gaza. If he blames restrictions on Gaza, he should remember that when we pulled out, there weren't restrictions on Gaza. It wasn't the restrictions that led to terrorism. It was really the terrorism that led to the restrictions. And regarding humanitarian aid, Israel has been trying, as you know, with the international community to try and figure out a way of getting humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. The trouble is, over the past 16 years since Hamas took over in a bloody coup, it has racketeered. It has taken the humanitarian aid. It has taken the concrete that was supposed to be for hospitals and built terror tunnels with it. Unless we can find a way of making sure that humanitarian aid gets to the people of Gaza who need it, we are not going to be supporting terrorist activity.
But isn't that then down to Israel to allow in more aid? I mean, we've seen, I think it's still only some 20 trucks that have gone in through the Rafah crossing. You've got hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced. And the UN Refugee Agency is now saying that unless it can get fuel, it will have to stop its operations tomorrow.
So again, I think the international community needs to look a little bit closer. The fact is one of the reasons that there isn't sufficient electricity, for example, going into Gaza, although 50% of the electricity comes from within Gaza, is because Hamas itself has bombed so many of the electricity lines running into Gaza. It's bombed the crossing points to stop aid getting in. And we've been working hard with the international community, with the aid agencies, to try and find a way to make sure that the aid gets to the people who need it. Just getting trucks across the crossing point is not achieving anything if from that point onwards it is commandeered by Hamas, never reaches the people and just helps their terrorist efforts.
But Daniel, surely you would accept that many of those civilian lives that have been lost because of the blockade of Gaza by the Israelis, as well perhaps as the activities of Hamas inside Gaza. And isn't there a risk that if civilians continue to suffer in this way, that Israel will start to lose some of the international support that it's been enjoying from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from France and others?
Carol, sadly, there are risks every which way that we look. The reason that civilians are injured and killed is because Hamas has made a conscious decision, a callous decision, that its most effective means of operation is to use them as human shields, to bury itself amongst them and beneath them. In that situation, you are absolutely right. We have to be careful. We have to show a care that Hamas in its dreams would never show. But we cannot adopt a position, whether the Secretary General of the UN likes it or not, we cannot adopt a position where the moment that a terrorist hides beneath a school or a kindergarten, they enjoy impunity and they are out of bounds, because that will send a message to every terrorist organization in the world that if you only hide in kindergartens, then you can act without impunity.
Well, that was Daniel Taub, former Israeli ambassador to the UK, who's also advised Israel's missions to the UN and been a member of Israeli negotiating teams in the past.